Hey folks, trying to reply to requests and questions people have. So I'm going to talk about a poem called Disused Shed in County Wexford by Derek Mahon. It's not a poem I often teach. It's a magnificent poem. But when I look at Mahon, when I'm looking at the material, I'm always looking at the other H4 student who wants to get to H3. You know, that guy, that person's always in my head. And one of the things you can do sometimes is you can get bogged down in the in things that are overcomplicated. So with Mahon, there are 5 or 6 poems that are really straightforward. Kinsale, After the Titanic, Antarctica, Ecclesiastes, Rathlin. These are the Chinese restaurant in Port Rush. These are poems which are, you know, they're not massively difficult. There's depth and substance and layers to them. Yes, there are, but like we can get them. And this poem is of a different order. And sometimes I shy away from talking about poems like this because I'm afraid that, I'm going to light my candle here, that I'll get carried away. But there's been a request. So I'm going to talk about it. And I'm not going to tell you, as I always talk about these videos, I'm not the Mr. Poetry, and I'm happy to be told that you have a different interpretation, but I'm going to give you my interpretation of this poem. So let's talk about it. Okay, now, first thing is the quote at the start, the epigraph. Let them not forget us, the weak souls among the asphodels. So that's from a poet by a Greek poet called, I think it's George Sepharis. And you can figure out how to pronounce that yourself. But don't forget what an epigraph is meant to be. Earlier on today, I just recorded analysis of T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I'm going for the heavy stuff today. I think that's the mood I'm in. And that also starts with an epigraph from Dante's Inferno. And I explained in that part 1 of that analysis that the purpose of the epigraph is to kind of set the tone for the theme or themes that are going to be discussed in the poem. Now, when you think about that quote there, the most important thing for you to think about is the asphodel. And the asphodel is a type of wild flower, like a herb. But in Greek mythology, it was associated with the underworld. And that means it was associated with death. So when you look at the first 5 words of the poem, let them not forget us, you get the sense that this is a poem about remembering. And it's a poem about remembering those who've passed, those who've gone before us. I think more than anything else, this poem is about the big picture of human history and about what connects us, which is our fragility and our suffering. And I think it's about the idea of forgetting. And I think it's about the importance of remembering. The fact that he refers to weak souls, that the quote he begins with refers to weak souls, is an indicator of what happens in this poem. There are references in the poem to victims of the Holocaust. But there are also references in the poem to victims of political violence, like, Goya's. Have you ever seen those paintings that Goya, I think they're called the black paintings, that Goya produced in the at the time of the Napoleonic Wars in Spain? The images of political executions, the 1916 leaders, people who've died as a result of political killings. There are echoes of the powerless from history all the way through the poem. And I suppose the whole point of this poem is Mahon is meditating on how throughout history and as part of the story of humanity, there is isolation and there are people who are victims of mistreatment and who suffer terribly. But how when we in our lives are getting on with life, we forget them. And this is a poem about remembering them. And I think that's why he opens with the reference to J.G. Farrell. J.G. Farrell was he was an Englishman. He was an Anglo-Irish novelist. And, oh Jesus, what's the name of the book he wrote that blew my tiny mind? About India. Let me have a look here for a second. The Siege of Krishnapur. There's a book I recommend to you. But J.G. Farrell also wrote books about like Anglo-Irish Ireland. The Anglo-Irish culture in Ireland. The strand or layer of society, the ascendancy that Yeats came from and Markowitz came from, and which are gone. And he wrote novels that described the disappearance of that world. And Mahon was inspired by Farrell. And I think that's why he dedicates the poem to him. That idea of thinking about the past and things that have disappeared and the echoes of those things, that's important to Mahon. That's why he writes this poem. Outside of the specifics of this poem, this is one of the most interesting quotes for you to learn. And I would highly recommend you learn it off by heart, because I think it helps you understand Derek Mahon as a writer. The opening line of this poem is, "Even now, there are places where a thought might grow." Even now, there are places where a thought might grow. 12 syllables. The language is really simple. You know, the only word that has more than one syllable is places. It's direct. It's confident in the sense of he knows what he wants to say. And when I think of Derek Mahon's poetry, I think of As It Should Be, or After the Titanic, or any of those poems I've already mentioned. Grandfather, there's so many of them. I think of somebody who's always thinking and always trying to provoke thought in others. And I've no idea whether that's the case or not. I can never ask Mahon because he's passed away. But I do think that's something I see in his poetry. This desire to be thought provoking, to force us to look as readers, to look at familiar stories and familiar scenarios, but from a different perspective. Like, how can somebody be both ridiculous and sublime? Why is it that Bruce Ismay is such a pathetic figure and yet garners our sympathy or empathy when he says, "Heart rolls down like a stone, include me in your lamentations"? Why is it that his depiction of, the brutal fanatic who says, "Let us hear no idle talk of the moon in the Yellow River," is so compelling and As It Should Be? Why is the image of Swarla Bui standing on the mainland hearing the screams of his women being carried across to him? Why is that such a profoundly impactful image? So Mahon's poetry fundamentally is thought-provoking. And this is a deeply thoughtful and reflective poem. The opening stanza is filled with images of places where there once was life and there once was activity, but now there's abandonment. Peruvian mines worked out and abandoned to a slow clock of condensation. An echo trapped forever and a flutter of wildflowers in the lift shaft. I love that. It's very evocative. I love the onomatopoeia of flutter. I love the alliteration of the F, and I know it's more consonants, but the repetition of the F sound there. So we have flutter, we have flowers, we have lift, we have shaft. You know, you're brought to that place there. This was once a place where there was, you know, industry and activity, and now there's emptiness and just the fluttering sound of the wildflowers which grow along the lift shaft, and as the breeze comes down. So this idea of what the remnants of the past, the ghosts of the past, the reminders of the fact that change is inevitable, that nothing is permanent. Then we go to Indian compounds. I think that has to be a nod to Farrell, where the wind dances and a door bangs with diminished confidence. And again, there's the second example of onomatopoeia in the poem. A door bangs. So like the place has been abandoned. The door's not locked. The door's blowing in the wind. There's nobody there to close it. There's nobody there to hear the sound of the bang. So he's appealing to our aural and our visual senses. Lime crevices behind rippling rain barrels. Dog corners for bone burials. And then we have, and in a disused shed in County Wexford. So all of these are images of things that are past, where there was life and now there isn't, where there was value which has now been discarded, where there was purpose and now there's just emptiness. So he's forming these ideas in our minds by these references to Peruvian mines, to, you know, sheds in County Wexford, to Indian compounds where doors bang. There's a ghostliness, an eeriness to the opening sequence, which is really, really, really interesting. And then in the second stanza, he introduces, I suppose they're the stars of the show, aren't they? The mushrooms. And the mushrooms in the poem represent I mean, when I write that down, I feel like I need to punch myself in the face. It sounds very pretentious. The mushrooms in the shed, which grow, you know, and survive despite the fact that there's almost nothing for them to grow on, which eke out an existence in the darkness. They represent all of the people that Mahon is thinking about in this poem. I keep on saying the big picture. Mahon's such a big picture poet. They represent all those, you know, innumerable, impossible to count, long forgotten people who have, in one iteration or another, in one place or another, in one crisis or another, suffered the injustices and the unfairness of life. There's this amazing image of them crowding to a keyhole because they're in the darkness. But this one shaft of light comes through that keyhole. This is the one star in their firmament. It's extraordinary imagery. You can see the light coming through the keyhole into the darkness. You can see the mushrooms who grow towards the light, desperate for light. And this light and darkness imagery somehow communicating the absence of hope and the desire for hope, and how we cling on to, you know, in times of crisis, in times of despair, in times of suffering, how we cling on to and we lean towards any glimmer of light, any glimmer of hope. Or frames a star within a star. What should they do there but desire? So many days beyond the rhododendrons, with the world, and this is a crucial quote to learn, with the world waltzing in its bowl of cloud. They have learned patience and silence, listening to the rooks querulous in the high woods. And again, it's very, very evocative, where it brings us into the shed. We can see the shaft of light coming in. We're in the darkness, but we can also see this bowl of blue sky, this bowl of cloud. floating outside. And we have this image of dancing, that while the mushrooms are in the shed, crowded together in the darkness, desperate for light, outside there's a whole world going on, ignoring them, oblivious to their existence, dancing and full of life and vigour and energy. The rook, that's a bird, like a crow. Querulous means given out. When you hear birds, singing or cawing, they're basically saying, feck off, this is my territory. Querulous means argumentative. So we have this outside world, and then we have this inside world. We have this world where we go to, I don't want to get myself in trouble, but we go to retailers which sell clothes for next to nothing. And we buy them, and we consume all this materialism. And we never think about the people in the factories in places like Bangladesh and places like Vietnam and places in the Congo, where they have to work in modern day indentured slavery to dig out the rare earths that make our mobile phones work, so we can take videos and make each other laugh. And we just waltz our way through the world. We just waltz our way through life, and we never think about those. We don't think about those less fortunate than us, crowded together in the darkness, searching for light. And that's what this poem is about. This poem is about those people. It's about those people in the past, and it's about those people today. And it's a moving poem. It's an important poem because of that. They have been waiting for us. Why waiting for us? Why waiting for us? To rescue them? Waiting for us in a fetor. That means a stink, a stench of vegetable sweat since Civil War days. They're suffering, the Irish Civil War. Since the gravel crunching, there's another brilliant example of onomatopoeia. Appealing to our olfactory sense with the reference to the fetor, appealing to our aural sense with the gravel crunching, compound word adjective. Interminable departure of an expropriated mycologist. And again, you might read that and go, fuck off, what? A mycologist is somebody who basically studies mushrooms. Yeah, that's a job. So I suppose the point that the poet is making is that every once in a while, some rare beast comes along who takes an interest in these mushrooms. But most of the time, the world just goes on and ignores that they're there. Every once in a while, somebody comes along who cares about the weak and the vulnerable. But most of us don't give a shit. And we get on with our lives and we ignore them. Every once in a while, we might think of those who suffered in the famine, or the terrible tragedy of our Civil War that gave birth to the state that we live in today, and all those rights that we take for granted and we place no value on, but that people died for and killed for and suffered for. Every once in a while, the expropriated mycologist comes along and shows an interest, but most of the time, there's nothing. There's no interest. He never came back, and since then is a keyhole rusting gently after rain. I don't know what it is about that line that just really gets me. I know that the sounds of the line, we have since rusting, we have the lovely, lovely, lovely alliteration there as well. Sorry, the sibilants of since and rusting and keyhole gently after rain. There's something beautiful in that line. How can a keyhole rust gently? There's just a movement of time. That's all. Spiders have spun, nature imagery. Flies dusted to mildew. And once a day perhaps they have heard something, a trickle of masonry, a shout from the blue, or a lorry changing gear at the end of the lane. There's a world going on outside there. There's a world getting on with life, but they're stuck inside, suffering together. There have been deaths the pale flesh flaking into the earth that nourishes it. Again, the alliteration is so good there. So the mushrooms die and then they decompose, and nightmares born of these and the grim dominion of stale air and rank moisture. So the horror of being inside this place. Those nearest the door grow strong. Elbow room has to be evocative of the Holocaust, has to be evocative of those gas chambers. People crowded together, trying to survive in the most hellish, nightmarish circumstances. The rest in a twilight of crumbling utensils and broken pitchers, groaning for their deliverance. You know, in the shed, there's old tools that are not used anymore. There are buckets and utensils that are abandoned. But most of all, there's groaning. Another example of onomatopoeia for their deliverance. Deliverance means to be rescued. These images of human suffering, of those groups, those people who in the past and in the present and in our future will be abandoned and will be desperate for rescue and will know that the world is carrying on irregardless of their suffering, trying to survive, leaning, crowding in towards the light. The weaker ones unable to survive, the stronger ones elbows out trying to cope. Have been so long expectant that there is only left the posture. A half century without visitors in the dark. Poor preparation for a cracking lock and the creak of hinges. The onomatopoeia again of creak. Magi, moon men, powdery prisoners of the old regime. A reference there perhaps to revolutionary France and the Bastille, you know, the prisoners. When he says old regime, is that a reference to the Ancien regime? Which is what the pre-revolutionary France was known as. You know, web-throated, stalked like triffids, racked by drought. Look at these images of suffering and insomnia. And only the ghost of a scream at the flashbulbs firing squad. I mentioned, you know, Goya and 1916 and all these political killings. You know, flashbulb firing squad. We wake them with shows. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about when I talk about the flashbulb firing squad. This is the image I'm talking about. It's a very, very famous painting. It's called the 3rd of May, 1808. And it shows these prisoners, these Spanish prisoners being executed by French forces during this conflict in the Napoleonic Wars. And it's that Goya puts this blast of light on that Christ figure in the middle with his arms up in the crucifix stance. And it's just another image of injustice, another image of cruelty, another image of somebody powerless in history. So you see, the thing is about this poem, as I said, you can get really complicated. I'm skipping over bits and pieces. I'm not going into every word and every line, but you have to get, as I keep on saying with Mahon, it's the big picture. We have people facing firing squads. We have people in prisons held by tyrannical regimes. We have people groaning for their deliverance. We have people crowded together in nightmarish conditions looking for elbow room. We have death with the pale flesh flaking into the earth. We have suffering. And he writes this poem to remember those who've suffered. And he says, we take them with at the flashbulb firing squad, we wake them with shows there is life yet in their feverish forms. Grown beyond nature now, soft food for worms. They lift frail heads in gravity and good faith. And that image of soft food for worms, I think, is important. There's an idea of cycles there. The idea of death leading to decay, but decay then feeding new life. And that new life then feeding into what comes next. There's a cyclical nature. We're not separate from these things. These things become part of our culture. These things become, we are immersed in these events. They are part of who we are. They lift frail heads in gravity and good faith. They are begging us, you see, in their wordless ways, to do something, to speak on their behalf, or at least not to close the door again. It's a brilliant line. Sorry, now. A brilliant line. I want to think about what he means there for a second. He says they are begging us. So it's an appeal to the reader as well as to himself. All these people are begging us. Begging us for what? Not to forget them. So forget them in the past, but I think as well in the present. And this poem just rings so true to me in this world that we live in, this materialistic May Feiner world that we live in, which unfortunately so many times, and this is not the case with everybody, but so many times people don't give a shit about how they affect other people. And Mahon this is the value of poetry. Mahon is forcing us to think about how maybe we need to think about other people. And not just, despise them or reject them as weak souls. So in this poem, he tries to speak on their behalf. In this poem, he tries to open the door to let some light in on these people. That's what he's trying to do. He feels inadequate doing it. So the least he can do is not close the door again. It's about that importance of speaking up. It's about that importance of, if you think something is important, of saying it's important. It's about that awareness of others. It's about those less fortunate than us. And why recognizing them, just recognizing them, recognizing their existence is of value. I don't know whether he thinks that being a poet is a meager, the limited power of any art to address such issues, but at least it's trying. The last part of the poem, again, you're talking about the span of history. Treblinka was a death camp during the Holocaust in the mid 20th century. Pompeii, we know, 79 AD, Vesuvius blows its top and thousands of people, we don't know how many, died. So these are all images of people who are lost in the past. Save us, they seem to say, the repetition. Let not the God abandon us who have come so far in darkness and in pain. We too had our lives to live. And when you read that, you tell me that you don't think of Bruce Ismay in After the Titanic. You tell me that you don't think of Soir Le Puy in Rathlin. You tell me that you don't think about that proprietor of the Chinese restaurant looking out on an ideogram over a sea cloud. You tell me that you don't think of Lawrence Oates, the solitary enzyme, as he stumbles away towards his death at the heart of the ridiculous, the sublime. Mahon is interested in people. He's interested in the value of people. And A Disused Shed in County Wexford is a great poem because it makes the reader think about people, other people, and their suffering. And it doesn't give them voice. He says, save us, they seem to say. He can't speak for them. But all he can do is try to communicate his sense of their importance in the poem. You with your light meter and relaxed itinerary. I love that. We have he's laughing at himself as a poet. Light meter. He's talking about the beat of his poetry. Meter spelled like that is about the iambic pentameter. The amount of beat you put in the line of the poem. And relaxed itinerary. Like he's not down those Peruvian mines. He's not somebody who has a hard life. He's aware of the fact that he's as a man of privilege. who has, what's that phrase, first world concerns. He's aware of his inadequacy. But he's also aware of a sense of, I think, a sense of duty. And that's why the poem ends with, let not our naive labours have been in vain. And I think there, when he says, let not our naive labours, I think he's actually talking about poetry. I think he's talking about the poet's work. I think that when he says our there, he's talking about himself and people like him. And their labour is their work. And it might be naive, as in somewhat innocent, to think that you can write something that's going to have an impact on the world. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth doing it. In the same way as it might be naive for someone like me to think that there's value in teaching people like you poetry, to try to get you to think about your relationship with the world and with other people, and about these big ticket, big issue matters, or issues that matter. But I still think there's value in the work. I still think it's important that you read this stuff. I think it's important that you try to think about why he wrote this poem and what the imagery in the poem represents. So there you go. That's a disused shed in County Wexford. It is a properly great poem.